Welcome to Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer. In this episode, we explore the levels of consciousness, cosmology, and technology. Welcome, Dr. Greer.
Thank you. Glad to be with you again.
Thank you. You talk about the conscious holographic universe. Can you walk us through that?
Yes, I think it's really important for people to understand that right now you and I are awake and we're conscious, and everyone listening. That conscious mind, whereby you're awake, is actually an infinite field of awareness. We're only identifying it with ourselves, but in reality, it's always infinite and unbounded. And the reason we end up not identifying with the infinite, unbounded aspect of it is that we have been trained only to be focused on our own, what's right in front of us. So when you go into meditation, you can experience deeper, quiet consciousness, and then in that state, you can see remote places. That's remote viewing, or being a seer. You can see the future, and that's precognition. You can see other realms, the so-called worlds of light, astral, celestial, other dimensions, higher and lower. And you can perceive also the very structure of the cosmos, where the first emanations from the field of consciousness are beginning to emerge. And those first emanations are the tonality of thought. It's the sound component of thought. Interestingly, that's what a mantra is, chanting. But if you look at it from a structure of the cosmos point of view, it's that you have this impulse that emerges, that is itself conscious and consciousness. And that first emergence from the unbounded field of consciousness is the plane of the absolute, as the mystics call it. There's this stimulation, this initial thought from the Great Spirit, and it's called the primal thought. And that primal thought and tonality, that then differentiates into all that exists in the cosmos, in creation. Not just the material 3D, but all the worlds of light, all that exists. So that primal thought is constantly there. It's not like it came and went. It's a continuous presence. That then unfolds into the specific tonality, thought essence that's conscious within all things. So this primal thought then goes like a fractal into an infinite number of expressed things, stars, people, rocks, everything has this within it. So standing within every single point in space, time, or object is the unbounded consciousness, because all this is that, this emanation of tonality, primal thought, that then differentiates into that specific object. From there, you have the emanation of light. So the first emanation of light from the primal thought has been called the most great light. But from that most great light, you then have the expression into the light within all things. So then at that point, this emanation of the pure light form that's undifferentiated then becomes the worlds of light, they're called. And this can be all the different dimensions, higher, lower, angelic, celestial, to the very highest level. Now the highest level of the expressed is very, very close to that most great light primary emanation. So what happens is then from there, you have a template that interfaces, that creates time, space, matter, 3D. So I think for us to understand these extraterrestrial civilizations, we have to understand a new cosmology. So now let's talk about the technologies. If you're going to go from one point in space and time to another beyond the speed of light, you're traversing along, I call it the underbelly of the cosmos, but you have actually trans-dimensionally shifted into the astral or near astral. And, people think this is so hard to understand, but think about it. Most people have had a lucid flying dream where they see a place or a future. Well, how does that happen? It's because the consciousness within us And our deeper, subtle bodies are not as fixed in space and time and intellect as we normally associate, and therefore you can see a distant place, a distant time, a future event, a past event. So that is very much involved with extraterrestrial technologies, have those abilities that this cosmos that I'm talking about is actually utilized more fully. Let's say a fuller spectrum is used by interstellar civilizations than we are now on Earth. So that's really important. So now you get into this whole question of extraterrestrial spacecraft and civilizations and people. Yes, they can appear full 3D, but they could be hovering outside your window in 5D. What's interesting about this, I call this the gap in between, this interface between 3D and these other dimensions. And in that gap is a lot going on of where the material cosmos and what we call physical sciences can begin to interface with these more subtle, finer refinements, very fine versions of electromagnetism that are beyond the speed of light and matter into the near interface, where the astral, so-called, conscious light energy becomes form and matter. That is very much the mastery that happens between the science of consciousness and all its expressions and 3D physical sciences like we think of today on Earth. And that's our future. I mean, that's why I say the science of consciousness being integrated with physical understanding instead of it either or, it's going to be an integrated system. And this is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of CE5 contact and this subject. So everyone's heard about, the CIA remote viewing projects and all of that. Those are the low-tech ones. But that actually gets, when you get a really developed civilization or some of the more developed classified projects, those capabilities get, I call it routinized, where it's made routine scientifically through technological systems that interface with consciousness and thought. So this is where you get into the technology-assisted consciousness, where your consciousness can be assisted in remote viewing or seeing the past or the future through a technological system. And ETs have those devices because ET systems involve the ability to drop out of space-time linearity and be able to see things past, now, or future. Caveat, anything that's perceived in the future is only a probable future. The reason charlatans are always going to say on October 15th, XYZ is going to happen, is that by the time they utter it and see it, it can change the timeline or whether it will happen or not. So when you're talking about future, except for very big events that are sort of fixed, you're talking about the probability. Now the probability may be 99%. It's never 100% when you're talking off the right now or what's already happened. Everything that's happened in the past and happening now is engraven within the structure of these other dimensions and consciousness, and is always going on. Now, so here's an example of that. One of my military advisors was at the White Oaks Naval Facility in Maryland before it closed, and this was back in the 70s, and they had a device, a naval intelligence, where they could extract from what they call the white noise of space-time anything that had ever happened in any volume of space. So they could target, say, the space where this building is and see what's going on right now, or what happened last night, or what happened 1,000 years ago in this space, or happened 1,000,000 years ago, with absolute accuracy. And that was in, I think, 73, 4, that era. And it had been around a while. But those technologies, imagine what interstellar civilizations that have been going interstellar for hundreds or thousands or millions of years, they have generation 5,000 of this stuff. So just keep that in mind. So, and then you get into things like, for example, levitation. I've talked about the fact that a city that develops and can happen spontaneously is the ability to levitate. Well, how is that really happening? Well, when you're in a certain state of meditation, and it's sort of also connected to the heart and joy, it creates a And the heart has, 30, 40,000 neurons, by the way, and is electromagnetic, as is the brain, as is the whole body. You can alter the angular momentum and spin of all your molecules and atoms so you lift up. You click it a little further, you will dematerialize and disappear and appear somewhere else. This can all be done by developing higher states of consciousness, and everyone's read accounts of enlightened masters who could do this. Now there's a corollary to that. Obviously anti-gravity. Well, they're using an electromagnetic, very high voltage system to create the same effect that a very high consciousness state can affect. It's all both levitation of material objects. Similarly, when you get into these consciousness-assisted technologies, you can actually have consciousness that is interfacing with your technologies so that you teleport or materialize or lift things at a distance. That can be done technologically, and ETs have that. And then you have things like full-on teleportation. Now, those experiments began in the 40s, 50s. One of the disclosure witnesses was at an Air Force base in 53, where they were teleporting solid objects from one part of the base to another, and it would go from one electronic system to another and go boom, boom. And that was 53. So we know that that can be done technologically, but it can also be done, as I mentioned, through the cities, the higher states of consciousness. You see, there's a pattern here. Almost everything you've heard about that is a innate ability in consciousness can be made routine, routinized through scientific discovery, and has been, frankly. And the same thing, dematerialize, rematerialize. Now, in the ET systems and classified projects, these are trans-dimensional interstellar craft have to be able to drop out of 3D materialization, go through these other dimensions, we'll call it trans-dimensional, and appear at another point in space-time. And in a sense, they can create their own portals. So everyone thinks you have to have a pre-existing portal. Actually, CE5 groups, we are creating our own portal right above what we're doing. And the same thing with, you hear of masters who can materialize a ruby or an object.
Right.
Well, a little bit like Star Trek, ET civilizations, their manufacturing of their craft is through these trans-dimensional energy fields, where, and the reason when you see an actual ET craft, there aren't any parts to it. And in fact, the material in it is so pure that even in space we haven't been able to replicate the purity. Why? It's because it is materialized. It is brought in from, let's call them the elementals of this gap, from the near astral to the physical, and it is then resonantly, ultrasonically, and resonant fields brought into 3D. So that's an electronic system, but a very refined one. And that's how they materialize things. And then, you have other types of experiences, bilocation, trilocation. It means that an ET craft can be in multiple places at once. Now, enlightened masters have been able to bilocate and meet with more than one of their students at the same time. You hear these accounts. Well, it's the same thing in consciousness, but then made routine through electronic systems, because in reality, like the spooky effect Einstein talked about, you can have the same particle in two places at once. You can do the same thing, not just with a particle, but an entire spacecraft.